A new warning is rippling across West Asia, and it is coming from Yemen. Ansar Allah's foreign ministry says it is prepared to enter the war with full force if the United States and Israel resume what it describes as aggression against Iran and the wider axes of resistance. The message is not subtle, and it lands at a moment when tensions around one of the world's most critical maritime choke points are already spiking, the Strait of Hormuz. The immediate catalyst is a dramatic escalation announced by U.S. President Donald Trump, who says the U.S. Navy has begun enforcing a sweeping blockade tied to traffic in and out of Hormuz, alongside operations aimed at clearing what Washington says are Iranian mines. This isn't just regional brinkmanship. Hormuz is a lifeline for global energy flows, and the mere perception of disruption can rattle fuel markets, insurance rates, shipping routes, and the price of everyday goods. Yemen's leadership is now explicitly linking its threat of our involvement to that maritime pressure campaign, warning that a confrontation at sea will not stay at sea. From Yemen's perspective, the pivot toward the waterway is an admission that previous pressure failed. The Houthi-aligned ministry frames Trump's talk of taking the confrontation to the high seas as proof that earlier rounds of military and political coercion did not break Iran, and in their telling produced the opposite effect. On Trump's side, the posture is blunt. In a Truth Social post, he wrote, he said, effective immediately, the finest in the world will begin the process of blocking any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. He also claimed U.S. forces would begin destroying mines he says Iran placed in the strait, and he warned the U.S. military is locked and loaded, urging Tehran to end what he described as a crisis. Iran's leadership is rejecting the pressure and signaling that any escalation will be met well. If escalation, Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, speaking after the blockade announcement, dismissed the idea that threats could force Iran's hand. He said threats will not work with Iran. He also underscored that Tehran, while leaving a door open for diplomacy, will not accept negotiations framed by coercion. He said Iran would respond to force with force, and added that dialogue remains possible only if it is based on respect. Behind the public threats and counter-threats is an attempted diplomatic track that has not so far produced a breakthrough. Over the April 1-1-2 weekend, U.S. and Iranian delegations held a marathon round of talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, roughly 21 hours under mediation efforts involving regional intermediaries. The negotiations ended without a deal, and the gaps appear fundamental. Both sides talk about wanting a pathway to de-escalation, but they are still split over core demands and what each side sees as basic security. Wide guarantees Yemen's messaging is now folding those talks into its narrative. Houthi-aligned officials portray Iran's posture in Islamabad as a diplomatic victory, arguing that Washington is trying to gain at the table what it failed to secure through military action. In their framing, even the act of negotiating is an admission that the pressure campaign did not deliver a decisive outcome. But the most consequential part of Yemen's signal is not the rhetoric about talks. It is the readiness to widen the battlefield. The Houthis have already shown in recent years that they can disrupt maritime traffic in strategically sensitive corridors, particularly around the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, using missiles, drones, and naval-style harassment that forces commercial shipping to reroute or slow down. That track record is exactly why their current warning is being watched closely by security planners and energy markets. If Yemen begins acting on its threat, and if Iran responds DS in kind around Hormuz, the world could be looking at a compounded shipping crisis, pressure at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, plus renewed risk along routes connecting the Indian Ocean to the Suez corridor. Even a limited spike in incidents can have outsized consequences because shipping is not just about fuel. It's about timing, supply chains, and the cost of doing business across continents. The transcript's underlying claim is that the conflict's arc has been widening since late February. According to the account being circulated, the current escalation traces back to February 28th, when U.S. and Israeli airstrikes reportedly hit Iran and targeted senior officials and commanders, followed by sustained Iranian retaliation. The reported pattern since then has been near daily missile and drone launches aimed at Israeli-linked targets and at U.S. assets spread across the region. Whether every claimed strike meets the threshold of an operational hit is often contested in wartime messaging, but the trajectory is clear. The confrontation is no longer contained to a single front, and each side is trying to impose costs while avoiding a collapse into all-out regional war. Now Yemen is signaling it won't stay on the sidelines if the pressure on Iran intensifies. A separate, more political warning is also coming from the top of the Houthi-run governing structure in Sana'a. Mahdi al-Mashat, who serves as chairman of Yemen's Supreme Political Council, has issued a stark appeal to Arab and Islamic states: do not become instruments of a U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran. The message is framed as both a warning and a test of alignment. He reaffirmed Yemen's full solidarity with Tehran, insisting that Iran has the right to defend itself against attack and to confront what he called aggressor regimes. And he directed his sharpest language toward governments he believes may enable the campaign, whether through intelligence support, basing access, political cover, or key at cooperation. His central warning is being repeated in regional media in similar form. If countries cannot help stop what he describes as a Zionist conspiracy, then they must not assist in carrying it out. The underlying pressure is clear neutrality, and his framing may not be treated as neutral if it materially supports U.S. or Israeli operations. For Gulf states and neighboring capitals, that creates a dangerous dilemma. On one side, the security relationships and defense arrangements many have with Washington. On the other, the risk that any perceived cooperation draws them into the line of fire, directly or indirectly, through attacks on ports, pipelines, bases, or commercial infrastructure. Ansar Allah's broader statement of support for Iran goes further still, portraying Tehran's retaliation not simply as self-defense, but as defense of the region and the Islamic world. In that narrative, Iran is positioned as a bulwark against unchecked Israeli dominance, and Yemen's role is cast as part of a wider resistance front. That messaging matters because it hints at the potential scope of targets if Yemen escalates. Houthis have previously threatened and at times acted against shipping that they say is linked to Israel or its partners. In practice, disruption often spills beyond the stated target, set affecting neutral vessels and global logistics. Meanwhile, Trump's blockade threat and the start of enforcement pushes the conflict into the domain where miscalculation is most likely. A naval blockade is not just a political statement. It requires interdictions, warnings, inspections, and potentially the use of force in crowded sea lanes. It also risks accidental escalation, a misidentified vessel, a drone sighting a radar lock, a warning shot that is read as an attack. And in a waterway as narrow and strategic as Hormuz, the room for error is minimal. Iran has repeatedly signaled that it views threats to Hormuz as existential pressure, and it has a range of options from harassment and asymmetric tactics to more direct maritime action. The U.S., for its part, is showing it is prepared to respond swiftly and publicly telegraphing that response. This is why analysts warn the economic shock could be global, even if the fighting remains regionally concentrated. Energy prices respond not only to what has happened, but to what markets fear could happen next. And shipping reacts not only to attacks, but to risk assessments. Insurers raise premiums, companies reroute, delivery schedules slip, and costs pass down the chain. So the story now has three tracks running at once, each one feeding the others. First, the military track, a widening confrontation since late February with strikes, retaliation, and new threats of additional fronts. Second, the maritime track, a U.S.-declared blockade around the Strait of Hormuz and mine-clearing operations, with Iran warning it will not be coerced. Third, the political track, Yemen's leadership telling regional states to choose carefully while framing support for Iran as a moral and strategic necessity. Together, they create a volatile mix: high-stakes shipping lanes, maximalist rhetoric, and an environment where each side believes backing down invites more pressure. If the next days bring renewed attacks or a sharp incident at sea, Yemen's warning suggests the conflict could expand quickly, turning a regional standoff into a broader economic and security crisis that reaches far beyond West Asia. And that is the core danger right now. A war being fought with missiles and drones on land, but with the global economy held hostage.